content was created by Shaza Tar and is the property of Autism Therapy and Training, Inc. All rights are reserved. This training program is based on the Registered Behavior Technician task list and is designed to meet the 40-hour training requirement for the RBT credential. The program is offered independent of the BACB.
Hello everyone, hope you're having a great day today. Welcome to our measurements class. I'm your course instructor, Shaza Tar, and I'm happy to be here with you today. Today we're going to start talking about the first items on our task list. So get your cue cards ready. We'll be discussing a lot of important terms. As you can see, we'll be discussing data collection and the different methods we can collect data. We'll start off by talking about how to prepare for data collection, implementing continuous measurement procedures such as frequency and duration, implementing discontinuous measurement procedures, implementing permanent product recording procedures, and we're going to leave entering data and updating graphs for a later class. Aristotle once said that quality is not an act, it's a habit. Taking data and recording it doesn't happen overnight. You don't become good at it without practice. The more you actually take data and make it a habit, the better that you become at it. In practice, the reality is so much is happening. If you're a teacher in a classroom and you have maybe 20 other kids that you need to attend to, it's really hard to keep on top of your data or remember to write it down. If you're an instructor therapist working with clients in an IBI program, you're dealing with behaviors, classroom routines, lunches, spills, and so on. So you don't want to neglect data, but you want to be good at how do you manage your time and remember to collect the data, track it, write it down, and so on. And we'll be discussing those as we go along the way. Measuring behavior is one of the most important elements of behavior analysis. It allows a practitioner to quantify behavior and show clear behavior changes, see the effectiveness of a treatment. It helps end treatments based on pseudoscience. And therapists can be accountable to clients, employers, and society. Without data, we have nothing. We can't determine if the behavior has improved or not. We can't see if the procedure being used should be continued or not. Many years ago, when I was doing therapy, I took a family on that was going through a transition from one provider to me. I sat down with the current therapist to look at the child's binder, programs, progress, and just to kind of understand where things were at. I looked at the program binder and everything was in percentages. I thought, all right, great. So I looked at some of the programs and I said, oh, well, here, he's getting 70% on skills. That's great. The therapist said, well, it's an approximation. I didn't quite understand what she meant by that. She explained further that they would run 10 trials, let's say, and out of those trials, they would guess how many he got right. As you can see, that information wasn't very helpful. I had no idea whether or not he truly had these skills, and the data really meant nothing to me. Firstly, you need to know what behavior you're looking at. So there needs to be a clear definition of the behavior. Behaviors need to be defined in observable and measurable terms. If you can hear it, smell it, see it, taste it, it's observable. If you can count it, it's quantifiable. Clearly defining the behavior helps practitioners identify when the behavior has occurred. The next thing we need to do is determine the data collection method. Are we going to count it? Are we going to time it? Next, we need to gather appropriate items to help us collect the data. So what are some things that you might need? You may need a stopwatch, a timer or clock, pencil, paper, clipboard, data sheets, and so on. Then you actually have to collect the data. You'll then need to graph the data, and you and your supervisor can then sit down and analyze it. Okay, so get your cue cards ready because we are going to go over a lot of definitions here. There are 3 dimensions of behavior. The first one is repeatability, which is counting the number of times the behavior occurs. Counting the number of times the behavior occurs is referred to as frequency and rate. They are short and quick behaviors. So if you want to measure something like hitting, frequency would be a good measure. Hitting is short and quick. The next one is temporal extent. And this is a behavior that occurs for a length of time. Length of time is the duration. These behaviors typically last for some time and have a clear beginning and end to it. For example, the length of time you can hold your breath underwater. And finally, temporal locus, which is the behavior that occurs at some point in time in relation to other events. These are known as latency and interresponse time. Measuring the wrong dimension of the behavior can be problematic in finding an effective treatment for the client. Let me explain. I want you to measure the number of times I say, Okay? Easy enough? Here we go. Now you probably counted 2 instances of the behavior, right? You're probably thinking, well, that was just too easy. What's the trick? Well, although there were 2 instances of the behavior, the duration of the behavior was quite long. So the behavior lasted a long time. Although there were only 2 instances of the behavior, the length of the behavior was quite long and may actually be problematic. So when we're looking at the dimension of the behavior, we need to ensure that we are looking at the right dimension of the behavior and not just collecting any type of data. There are 2 types of measurement: continuous measurement and discontinuous measurement. Continuous measurement is implemented when every instance of the behavior is collected throughout the day. Frequency, rate, duration, latency, interresponse time can be used to collect the behavior all day long. Let's break this down some more. Frequency and rate are the number of times a behavior occurs per unit of time. Frequency is used when the observation period is the same each day. For example, the child attends the program every day from 9 a.m. until 3 p.m. With frequency, we would say that the behavior occurred 8 times per session, knowing the session is 6 hours long. Rate varies in that the observation period differs from day to day. At our center, some children come for 3 hours, and on another day they might come for 5 hours. With rate, you will need to take the number of behaviors and divide it by time. For example, 8 hits divided by 2 hours, which would equal 4. This means the behavior occurred about 4 times an hour. Let me demonstrate this in a more visual way. In this graph, you see on the left side a frequency graph in which a child engaged in behavior, let's say it's hitting, 8 times on Monday, 9 times on Tuesday, 8 times on Wednesday, and 9 times on Thursday. The child attends the program for 2 hours each day. The next slide shows the data and length of the session. The number of behaviors are identical to the first graph, the hitting graph. On Monday, the child attended the program for 2 hours and had 8 behaviors. This means that you would take the number of behaviors and divide it by the time. So in this case, 8 divided by 2, which equals 4. On Tuesday, there were 9 behaviors, but the session was only an hour long. So 9 divided by 1, which equals 9, and so on. So you can see that there were rates of 4, 9, 8, and 4.5. When we look at the graph visually, it looks very different than the other graph. We see the rate of behavior per hour, which is more accurate. So if the session times change, we want to ensure that we're using the right measurement. So frequency if the session times stay the same, and rate if there's a variation in the session times. Remember, frequency and rate behaviors are short-lived and quick, such as a hit, kick, pinch, scream, bite, or throwing objects. You can count the behavior right away. So this takes us into the next point, which is, in order for you to count these behaviors, you need some kind of instrumentation to count it or to collect the number of the behavior. So you can use things like a tally counter, you can make marks on a paper, you can use small objects like beads and put them into your pocket, but you will need some way to keep count of the behavior. So let's practice this. I want you to imagine I am speaking at a conference for behavior analysis, and you notice I say whoops a lot during my talks. You've mentioned it to me, but I don't really believe you. So I want you to count the number of times I say whoops in my speech. Are you ready? Here we go. Welcome everyone to the great world of behavior analysis. Whoops! I just dropped my pencil. Moving on, I'm excited to share the oops. Jeez, where was I? Yes. I was saying that I'm excited about sharing behavior analysis with you. Oh, whoops. So sorry, whoops. I spilled my water all over my speech. Alrighty, well that speech didn't go so well. How many of the behavior whoops did you count? If you counted 4, then you're absolutely right. Way to go. Okay, so what not to do? Don't keep count in your head. You'll forget. Many therapists I've overseen in the past will often say, oh yeah, no, I'm counting it in my head. It's all good. Don't worry, I won't forget. And trust me, you'll forget. So don't keep count in your head. If you make this a habit of yours, then your work in behavior analysis will just be sloppy, poor, and unethical. Next, let's talk about duration. Duration is the length of time of the behavior. The behavior has a clear beginning and end. For example, how long crying lasted, how long a child was off task, or how long a child played with Lego. You can measure this behavior using a timer or stopwatch. You start timing the behavior when it first occurs and stop the timer when the behavior ends. All right, let's practice this one. I want you to take duration data on the length of this next behavior. You'll need a timer of some sort. Don't panic if you don't have a stopwatch. You can use your phone or computer to time this behavior. Listen carefully. So how long was the behavior? Now you might find the duration that you got was not exactly like the duration that we're going to talk about in just a moment. It all depends on when you actually start the timer and stop the timer. So slight variations are possible, but you'll get good at this with practice. So the actual length of the behavior was 3.7 seconds. So if you didn't get it exact on, don't be disappointed, don't be hard on yourself. Once you see the behavior occurring, knowing to push on your timer or start collecting the data, and then knowing when the behavior actually stops sometimes can be a bit confusing because at the end of the laughter there, you could hear, a laugh here and there, and it didn't stop completely. It's not, super clear. But we still kind of had a clear idea as to when the laughter stopped. End of the behavior can be sometimes not as clear. And I've had a lot of therapists, often say to me, well, he's kind of whimpering, he's whining a little bit. And that's where the definition of the behavior becomes really important. When whimpering and whining is a part of the definition, then you know clearly that, when the child stops all of that, the crying, the kicking, the screaming, the whimpering, the whining, then that's when you know the actual behavior has stopped, and you can stop your timer. So, and we'll talk about, defining behaviors and the clarity of those that will really help you in your practice. I do want to caution you not to use clocks that do not have a second hand. I don't really like clocks altogether. You want to ensure that you have the right instrumentation so that you get accurate measures. Having a timer, stopwatch, something on your phone, on your computer is a really good choice. I know at our center, one of our biggest issues is the batteries always die on our timers. So having backup batteries or enough timers so that if a timer dies, and trust me, we have a lot of timers, but those batteries die because, I guess, of the overuse. So just make sure that you do have a backup plan, and your instrumentation is not something that is going to hinder your data collection. All right, moving on. So latency. You begin measuring when the instructions are given, because we want to see how long it takes before the learner actually engages in the appropriate behavior. So using your stopwatch, you start the timer when the instructions are given, such as clap your hands, then stop the timer when the client actually engages in the behavior, which is the clapping of the hands. Latency is actually a really important measure for behaviors like crossing the road. When the walk signal is presented, you want to ensure that the individual crosses the street at that point and not 20 seconds into it. So I would almost call this almost like a reaction time. It's kind of like driving. If you are in the car and the car in front of you presses on its brakes and you see the red taillights go off, not pushing on your brakes at some point and having kind of that 20-second reaction, delayed reaction, I should say, can be very problematic. So you want that kind of reaction time to be quite quick. Going back to the example of crossing the road, if the walk signal comes on and the client doesn't start walking until 20 seconds later, this could be very dangerous for the client, because then that walk symbol now might change to the stop, and the client may not have enough time to cross the road. Again, in schools, this would be an important measure when asking the client, for example, to do their work, like a worksheet, or start reading their book. How long does it actually take the learner to start their worksheet? So you might say to them, okay, do your math, and you put the worksheet in front of them, and they start playing with their pencil, and they're looking around the classroom. They might get up and get an eraser. They might sharpen their pencil, and then finally they start doing their work. That time is really important, because that's something that we might need to work on and decrease over time. Okay, let's practice this one. The instruction that is given will be clap hands. You will hear a clap at some point. We'll do this one together first, just to practice. When I say clap hands, start the timer, and when you hear the clap, you're going to stop the timer. Ready? Clap hands. So I got about 4.0 seconds, so we could say that it's roughly about 4 seconds. So if you got something close to that, that's great. Inner response time is the measure between behaviors. Using a stopwatch or timer, you would start the timer at the end of one behavior and stop the timer at the onset of the next behavior. In schools, teachers may be interested in the time it takes the student to do math questions. The teacher may measure the time between finishing one question and the next question. All right, let's practice this one. You're interested in a child's reading fluency. How fast and good is the child at reading? You'll hear me read a page from a children's book. Measure the time between the words. So start your timer when I read a word, and then stop the timer when I start the next word. So the sentence that I'll be reading is, "Once upon a time there was a boy." And I want you to take the time between a and boy. Once upon a time there was a boy. So if you got about 3.5 seconds, that was very good. Kelly is an RBT and was asked to measure her learner's behavior. She gets a tally counter, data sheet, and pencil. What continuous measurement is she about to use? Frequency and rate, or duration, latency, or interresponse time? And the correct response is frequency or rate. Helen is a teacher and noticed that her student Bob leaves the table to get an eraser. He takes his time walking around the class, looking at his peers before getting back to his seat. What continuous measure should Helen use? Frequency or rate, duration, latency, or interresponse time? And the correct response is duration. You want to see how long Bob is staying off task. Helen is a teacher and notices that Jenny takes a long time to copy words off the board. Helen decides to time how long it takes between each word. What continuous measure is Helen using? Frequency or rate, duration, latency, or interresponse time? And the correct response is interresponse time. Linda is an RBT who is taking data on the number of times Johnny bangs the table with his fist. What continuous measure is Linda using? Is it A, frequency and rate, B, duration, C, latency, or D, interresponse time? And the correct response is A, frequency or rate. Linda sends Johnny to go play with his toys. When she calls him back to the table, she begins timing. She stops her timer as he gets up and heads back to the table. What continuous measurement is Linda using? Is it frequency, duration, latency, or interresponse time? And the correct response is latency. Which one defines latency? A, time between behaviors. B, time from the instruction to the onset of the behavior. C, count. Or D, length of the behavior. And the correct response is B, time from the instruction to the onset of the behavior. Which one defines interresponse time? A, time between behaviors. B, time from the instruction to the onset of the behavior. C, count. Or D, length of the behavior. And the correct response is A, time between behaviors. Which one defines duration? A, time between behaviors, B, time from the instruction to the onset of the behavior, C, count, or D, length of the behavior. And the correct response is D, length of the behavior. Which one defines frequency or rate? Is it A, time between behaviors, B, time from the instruction to the onset of the behavior, C, the count, or D, length of the behavior? And the correct response is the count. Take the total number of behaviors and divide it by the length of the session. Is which of the following? A, frequency, B, rate. And the correct response is B, rate. I want you to take data on the number of times you hear the alarm go off. So a single beep would be considered a count. If you got 8, well done. If you didn't, go back and do it again. So now I want you to count the number of times you hear a can open. If you got 3, way to go. All right, so I want you to take duration on the next behavior that you hear. If you got about 4 seconds for this behavior, you got it. All right, so I want you to take duration data on the next behavior. Your neighbor is complaining that your dog barks a lot. How long is your dog barking for? So if you got about 9.7 seconds, you got it right on. All right, so now I want you to take latency data. So you've asked your learner to ring the bell. How long does it take for them to ring the bell? Good luck. Ring the bell. So I got about 5.83. So if you got something around that, that's very good. All right, so you're in a cafeteria and you ask the children to be quiet. Quiet. So I got 4.43 seconds. And if you got something close to that, then that's great. So now I want you to take data on inner response time. So if you got 3.2 seconds, you're on the right track. Way to go. Remember, quick behaviors that can be counted use frequency or rate to measure it. Behaviors that are long-lasting, such as playing with toys, use duration. When you're interested in looking at how long it takes for a learner to follow your instructions, latency is a perfect measure. And finally, inner response time is when you're interested in measuring between behaviors. Sometimes taking data all day can be very challenging or even impossible. Using discontinuous measurement can help our practice since it allows a practitioner to sample small intervals at different points of the day. Time sampling is when an observation period is broken down into smaller intervals of time, such as 10 seconds. The observer will indicate the presence or absence of the behavior. This method is often used when observing continuously is not feasible, as I mentioned before. In practice, whether it's at school, home, or a center, a caregiver, teacher, or other professional may not be able to observe the behavior for long periods of time. Discontinuous measurements allow the observer to collect segments of the behavior. This simplifies data collection, but it isn't the best method of data collection. It's important to be aware of this. Since you are only taking a sample of the behavior, you may over or underestimate it. There are three types of time sampling methods: partial interval recording, whole interval recording, and momentary time sampling. These time samples occur during an observation period, for example 5 minutes, and that observation period is broken into intervals of time, such as 5 seconds, 10 seconds, and so on. Partial interval recording is when you indicate the occurrence of a behavior at any time that it occurred during that interval. The key here is any time the behavior occurs. So if you are observing a child, let's say engaging in self-stimulatory behaviors such as hand flapping, we would set our timer to the interval time of, let's say, 10 seconds. And if we saw the behavior during that time, we would mark it down. Let me clarify this. When the behavior occurs during an interval, mark it down using a plus or an X. This would indicate that there was an occurrence of the behavior. If the behavior does not occur, we still want to mark it down, but we would mark it down with a minus or an O. This would indicate that there was no occurrence of the behavior. For partial interval recording, the behavior can occur at any time during that interval. For example, if you were to observe a behavior during a 5-second interval and it occurred at the 3-second point in one interval and 5 seconds at the next interval, you would indicate that the behavior occurred even though it did not occur for the entire time. At any point during the interval, if the behavior occurs, mark it down. This is a good recording system to use on behaviors you want to decrease, such as self-stimulatory behaviors. The reason for this is because since we are capturing only a small sample, and since we're taking down the data anytime that it occurs during that interval, we would be overestimating the behavior, making it a better choice for behaviors you want to decrease. Look at the next slide and notice the intervals are 10 seconds long. You also want to notice that in the first interval, the behavior occurred near the beginning. In the 30-second interval, the behavior occurred near the end. How many times did the behavior occur during this observation period? The correct answer is 3 occurrences. It occurred during the 10-second, 30-second, and 40-second interval. Look at the next slide and notice the intervals are 10 seconds long. You also want to notice that in the first interval, the behavior occurred near the beginning. In the 30-second interval, the behavior occurred near the end. How many times did the behavior occur during this observation period? The correct answer is 3 occurrences. It occurred during the 10-second, 30-second, and 40-second interval. Now, when you're taking partial interval data, you're not tracking where in the interval the behavior occurred, but only whether it happened or not. I'm going through this because I want to demonstrate the importance of recognizing that any time the behavior occurs, no matter where in the interval, you'll mark it down. Here's an example of a data sheet and partial interval data. We have 6 intervals of 10 seconds and a total observation period of 5 minutes. The therapist will mark a plus or minus depending on whether the behavior occurred or not. And then we can turn this into a percentage to see how much of the time the learner engages in the specific behavior of interest. You would then convert the occurrences over the total intervals into a percentage. For example, the first minute the behavior occurred 4 out of 6 intervals. Therefore, we would divide 4 occurrences by the total number of intervals to reach a percentage. How many behaviors occurred during this partial interval sampling? And the correct response is 4. How many behaviors occurred during this partial interval sampling? And the correct response is 2. How many behaviors occurred during this partial interval sampling? And the correct response is 5. Whole interval recording is when you mark a behavior if it occurred during the entire interval. Again, the key here is that the behavior has to occur for the entire time in order for you to count it. So if the interval was 10 seconds long and the behavior occurred at the first second and at the 5th second, you would not be able to count that. If the behavior occurred from the 1st second up until the 9th second, you would not be able to count that because it did not last the entire 10 seconds. Similar to partial interval recording, you would mark a plus or a minus if the behavior occurred or did not occur. Whole interval data is a good measure for behaviors you want to increase. The use of whole interval methods will underestimate the behavior because not all occurrences are accounted for, since they did not last the entire interval. Therefore, using it on behaviors such as play or on task would be good. For example, if you were observing on-task behavior, you would mark when the learner was on task. Suppose they were on task 3 times out of the 6 intervals, you would get 3 out of 6, and your percentage would be 50%. This would mean that the learner was on task 50% of the time. Take a look at the data here. The behavior occurred 5 times in total, but only 3 times did the behavior last the entire interval. The other intervals were partial, so we would not be able to count those. You can see at the 10-second interval it occurred the entire time, at the 50-second interval, and at the 60-second interval. How many times did the behavior occur? And the correct response is 3. There were 3 occurrences at the 10-second, 50-second, and 60-second interval. How many times did the behavior occur? There were 5 occurrences of the behavior at 10 seconds, 30 seconds, 40 seconds, 50 seconds, and 60 seconds. How many times did the behavior occur? If you said 0, you're absolutely right. Finally, momentary time sampling is when the behavior is observed at the end of the interval. The observer looks up at the end of the interval when a timer goes off to see whether the behavior occurred or not in that moment. The advantage to this method is the observer doesn't need to observe continuously and only needs to look at the end to see if the behavior happened or not. The problem with this method is many behaviors get missed. This method of measuring behavior is known for over and underestimating behaviors when intervals were more than 2 minutes in length. When intervals were less than 2 minutes, the results were very much like continuous measures such as frequency data. This method is great in classroom settings when a teacher needs to observe multiple children. A teacher can take data on several children rotating around the room. So how many times did the behavior occur in the observation period? Remember, you need to look at the end of the interval to see if the behavior occurred and disregard any other behaviors. So you can see that the behavior occurred at the 30-second interval and at the 40-second interval. Just to review, we were talking about discontinuous measurements, and we talked about partial interval recording, whole interval recording, and momentary time sampling. I put a chart here for you so that when you go to study, it makes it a little bit easier for you. All right, so let's go through some questions and see how you do. Good luck. Which method observes a behavior at the end of the interval? Is it A, whole interval, B, partial interval, C, momentary time sampling, or D, time delay sampling? And the correct response is C, momentary time sampling. Which method reports an occurrence at any time during the interval? Whole interval, partial interval, momentary time sampling, or time delay sampling? And the correct response is B, partial interval. Which method of time sampling must observe the behavior during the entire interval? Is it A, whole interval, B, partial interval, C, momentary time sampling, or D, time delay sampling? And the correct response is A, whole interval. Partial interval recording is recorded when? A, at the end, B, during the entire interval, C, counted throughout the day, or D, anytime? And the correct response is D, anytime. Whole interval recording is recorded when? A, at the end, B, during the entire interval, C, counted throughout the day, or D, anytime? And the correct response is during the entire interval. Momentary time sampling is recorded when? A, at the end of the interval, B, during the entire interval, C, you count it throughout the day, or D, anytime? And the correct response is A, at the end. Permanent product is when a behavior is measured after it has occurred. They can be used in all environments such as school or home. Permanent product recording is relatively easy to use. Teachers often use it when grading math or spelling tests. It can be used to observe behaviors by checking written work, completed worksheets, homework assignments turned in, audio tapes, and videotapes. They can be used to measure the number of correct responses in academic tasks such as spelling tests or math tests. Measure productivity per unit of time. For example, one can measure the number of envelopes stuffed per hour. Some behaviors cannot leave a permanent product unless videotaped or audio taped. A benefit to permanent products is that it allows practitioners to be absent during the observation period. They can review the worksheet or video session at a later time. Permanent product measures can be more accurate. For example, a practitioner can slow down the video or even pause it to see. I want you to look at the following worksheet. How many correct math questions did the learner get? If you counted 8, then you got permanent products right. You have a learner that screams long periods of time, and you would like to decrease the behavior. However, you only see the client once a week for 30 minutes. What is the best method of measurement? Is it A, frequency, B, partial interval recording, or C, duration? And the correct response is B, partial interval recording. You have a learner that engages in self-hits. You want to take data on this behavior. You have sessions 3 times a week and each session is 2 hours. What is the best method of measurement? Is it A, frequency, B, rate, or C, duration? And the correct response is A, frequency. Your supervisor is observing the learner. You find that your supervisor looks up after the timer beeps. What method of measurement is being used here? Is it A, momentary time sampling, B, partial interval recording, or C, whole interval recording? And the correct response is A, momentary time sampling. You want to take data on your learner's play behavior. You set aside 5 minutes and prepare your data sheet, which has 10-second intervals. You will indicate whether the behavior occurred only if it was present during the entire interval. Which method of measurement are you using? Is it A, momentary time sampling, B, whole interval recording, or C, duration? And the correct response is B, whole interval recording. Your supervisor is concerned about the time between responses during intensive teaching. She finds that the learner is too slow between the responses. What method of measurement is best used? Is it A, duration, B, latency, or C, inter-response time? And the correct answer is C, inter-response time. You tell your learner to clean up. You start your timer and find that it took him 20 seconds before engaging in the cleanup behavior. What method of measurement did you use? Is it A, latency, B, inter-response time, or C, duration? And the correct response is latency. Your learner is engaging in spitting behavior. You start taking data. On Monday, he had 5 spits in a 3-hour session. And on Tuesday, he had 18 in a 5-hour session. And on Friday, he had 9 spits in a 3-hour session. What measure should you use? A, frequency, B, rate, or C, duration? And the correct response is B, rate. Kelly is an RBT and she reviewed video footage of her learner engaging in aggressive behaviors at home. This is an example of which method of data collection? A, frequency, B, time sampling, C, permanent products, or D, frequency? And the correct response is C, permanent products. Everybody wants to be good at what they do. They want to be recognized for their hard work and good work. And sometimes in practice, people will get carried away with trying to be really good by fabricating data or putting in, let's say in our practice, teaching trials that never really existed or increasing percentages so that when their supervisor or coworkers look, they say, wow, that was amazing. I can't believe that you got, 100 trials in that 30-minute chunk. But the reality is being honest and having integrity is more important than the number of trials that you do, because at the end of the day, when you walk away, you're the only person who knows what really happened. And if those trials didn't really exist and they didn't really happen, you're going to feel terrible. And that's the worst thing that you can do for yourself. So I tell people, be honest in your practice and do the right thing. If for whatever reason you couldn't get the right number of trials or you didn't hit the target behavior or whatever the case may be, speak to your supervisor, tell them the truth, sit them down and explain to them that you're having a difficult time, let's say, engaging the learner, or that the learner is having these behaviors, or maybe the child is really having behaviors that have not been addressed and you're struggling with this and this needs to be brought up to the attention of the supervisor. So don't feel like you have to pretend it's always good and it's always perfect, because the reality is nothing is ever going to be perfect and nothing is ever going to just be the way that it is. As a supervisor, yes, I want, my staff to do the best and get the right number of trials in, because at the end of the day, I'm thinking of the client and I'm thinking about, I want to make sure that I'm getting as many trials for this child so that they can improve over time. But we also have to be realistic that this doesn't always happen. And when you have that honest conversation with your supervisor, it makes things a lot better and you'll feel good at the end of the day. And the supervisor will have a great understanding as to where you're coming from, because you're the person sitting in that chair working with that child at that time. I think it's also important for all of us to know that learning never ends as a practitioner. So, you're going through this RBT training, credential right now, or if you're just taking a couple courses to improve your knowledge, that's great. But the reality is it doesn't end here. And the more knowledge that you seek and the more courses that you take and the more workshops that you attend, the better it'll be for you and for your learner. The learner is as good as the teacher or therapist is. So the more knowledge that you have, the better that your learner will be, because the better skills that you have or the more skills that you have, you'll be able to use those in practice.